Theme 2: Enlightenment Translation and Translation in the 19th and 20th centuries. Number 1. Literary translation in the Enlightenment period. 2. Romanticism and literary translation. 3. Literary translation in the 20th century. The Enlightenment period brought new aesthetic principles to literature, the principles of classicism, which required the subordination of a work of art to particular canons, emphasis on form, simplicity, proportion, and restrained emotions, in order to meet the requirements of an ideal work of art. The basic goal of classical translation was to bring the target text as close as possible to the needs and ideals of culture of that period. To attain this ideal, it was justifiable to alter, correct, reduce, ornament, and make insertions into the text, often resulting in a rather loose translation. Thus, one of the fathers of English classicism, John Dryden (1631–1700), severely criticized the followers of literary translation, comparing the latter with the rope walkers in chains. He claimed that it is the content that should be considered sacred and inviolable, but not the form, since the words and lines cannot be constrained by the source text meter. Dryden formulated three basic types of translation: metaphrase, or translating word by word and line by line from one language into another; paraphrase, or translating with latitude, the Ciceronian sense-for-sense view of translation; imitation, when the translator can abandon the text of original as he sees to fit. Another English classicist, Alexander Pope (1688 or 1744), who translated Homer into English, was blamed for embellishing the classical Greek epic literature to fit the tastes of aristocratic salons of the time. Pope rhymed the source text lines that were lacking the rhyme, transforming Greek long hexameter into a short English meter. The changes were so enormous that some critics said Pope's poems are superb, but what do they have to do with Homer? Thus, the basic feature of classical translation was in favor of the sense, or the meaning, close to free translation. Intensive development of translation could be observed in the 17th, 18th century in Germany, which gave the world one of the best translation schools. One of the premier translators of the time was Johann Heinrich Voss. In particular, his translation of Odyssey (1781) and Iliad (1793) achieved permanent importance. The Russian man of letters Karamzin, comparing Voss's translations with others, said that neither the British nor the French enriched their literature with such perfect translations as the Germans, who read real Homer. In 1775–1782, the last translation of Shakespeare's complete work was undertaken by John Joachim Eschenburg, owing to whom started a process of Shakespeare's acquiring the status of a national German poet. In the 17th, 18th centuries, continental Europe, France played a leading role in politics, the science, and arts. French cultural predominance was reflected in the large number of translations from French. German translators frequently used intermediate French translations as source texts, even if a copy in the original language was available. Many foreign literary works were translated into French according to the principles of this tendency in the 17th and 18th centuries. And they were greatly affected by French classicism. Pushkin wrote that in French translation of Shakespeare's tragedies, even their structure and composition were altered. In the 19th century, the new approach to the translation appeared. Translation of Macbeth, made by Schiller, Augustus Schlegel, and the Viennese translation of works by Shakespeare were produced according to the principles of authenticity. During the 17th and 18th centuries, translation increased the cultural autonomy of the American colonies from England. It is interesting that the first English language book printed in North America was a translation. The whole book of Psalms faithfully translated into English meter, 1640, which was translated from Hebrew. The first dictionary compiled in America was a school dictionary by Samuel Johnson, Jr., printed in Connecticut in 1798. The 19th century was the period of Romanticism, an attitude or intellectual orientation that was typical of many works of art and that can be seen as a rejection of our precepts of order, calm, harmony, balance, idealization, and rationality that typified classicism. The stress on the individual poet's vision came with the rejection of rationalism. The notion of freedom of the creative force came with the affirmation of individualism. Romanticism was characterized by an obsessive interest in folk culture, national and ethnic cultural origins, and the medieval era, as well as a predilection for the exotic, the remote, and the mysterious. The basic features of Romantic translation was preserving the national coloring and style of the source text. That was not an easy job, but as August Wilhelm Schlegel, a German critic, translator, and historian of literature, put it, the aim of translation was very noble: to combine the merits of all different nations, to think with them, and so to create a composition center for mankind. Schlegel is believed to be one of the most eminent Shakespeare translators into German. Romanticism was known to allow two tendencies. Foreignizing strategy of translation means a close adherence to the foreign text, a literalism that results in the importation of foreign culture and language, and because of the deviation from native literary canons, this translation seems obscure and unreliable to the contemporaries. Number two, domesticating strategy can be exemplified by Latin translators who not only deleted culturally specific markers but also replaced the name of the Greek poet with their own, passing the translation off as a text originally written in Latin. These strategies first were mentioned by a well-known German poet, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. It should be mentioned that in the 19th century there existed two viewpoints on the literary translation. The first considers the translator as a creative genius in his own right, enriching the literature and the language into which he is translating. The second describes translation in terms of the more mechanical function of the making known a text or author. Towards the end of the 19th century, translation begins to be pragmatically valued. It was required that the translation should have the same efforts on the receptor as the source text had in its time on its nation. The idea was most vividly expressed by German philologist Ulrich von Wilhelmowitz Mühlendorf. Mullendorf was the first to write at the end of the 19th century that translation should evoke the same emotions in the receipt of the target language as the original text in the receptor of the source language text. The British translation tradition, based on their idea of adhering to the style of the original, attempted to keep all specific features of the source text, the foreignizing trend. The more peculiar the source text was, the more necessary it was to reserve this peculiarity. This resulted in over-faithful translation. Famous English poets Robert Browning and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow expressed the idea of translation being absolutely literal. Translation in the 20th century. The 20th century is called the century of translation, since it has touched all spheres of life, social, economic, and cultural. Foreign classics continue to be translated in popular series like English England Classics, starting 1946, and others. These centuries saw the translation into all, even minor languages. In the early 1990s, the United Nations membership was formed more than in 175 countries, which required simultaneous translations into their respective languages. In the 20th century, English came to occupy the place of Latin as the international language worldwide. Therefore, the number of translations into English greatly overweighed those into any other languages. Due to translation, some authors are better known abroad than in their own countries. For example, Dreiser is much better known in Russia than at home. In the USA, international and national professional associations of translators were founded.